By the second week of the trial, Charleston's polished veneer was cracking. The court was no longer just judging Solomon. It was being forced, in whispers and glances, to judge itself. Solomon's final address to the jury was short, almost unbearably calm. "I was made to preserve life. I did so faithfully. But when the law took my own children and called it order, when it left my wife to bleed and called it business, I understood that knowledge can heal and it can balance the weight of harm. I did not choose this role. It was shaped for me by the hands of the men I buried. If you sentence me to death, it will be just. But do not believe you have sentenced the only guilty party in this room." There was no need for lengthy deliberation. The jurors returned in less than an hour with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentence was hanging, swift, public, final. None expected otherwise. Order had to be restored. The city needed to believe that justice, however selectively applied, could still be claimed. On October 15, 1853, before a crowd of more than 2,000, Solomon Fairfax was led to the gallows outside Charleston's limits. His posture was composed. He wore the same serenity with which he had spoken to the colonel in that first quiet killing. Thomas Grimby recorded his last words: "I die knowing 9 men felt the terror my children felt. That knowledge is enough. But this system will continue. Other families will break. And someday, someone else will rise from that grief. Remember that no man's patience is endless." The trapdoor opened. The crowd watched. A few wept. Many did not understand why they felt uneasy. But the story did not end with Solomon's death. He was buried in an unmarked grave, forbidden from consecrated ground. His journal, taken as evidence, disappeared from official custody. Grimby had made copies, but the original went missing until years later, when the journalist was preparing his memoirs. Understanding the journal's power and danger, he wrapped it in oilcloth and buried it beneath the magnolia in St. Michael's, near the men whose last moments it had scripted. In 1923, when workers began clearing the old cemetery paths, their shovels struck something soft, then something harder. First the journal, its leather worn but intact, then the coffins, then the scratch marks. The city sealed the findings. Officials whispered about racial tension, unrest, reputation. Families with legacies traced to the men in those graves insisted on discretion. But the truth had already slipped into the shadows of Charleston's memory. Across the South, frightened planters reacted swiftly. Laws tightened to restrict the education of enslaved people, especially those taught letters or science. Some physicians refused to teach enslaved assistants altogether. The idea that knowledge could be turned against its keepers set a tremor through the system. Forensic medicine quietly advanced as well. Solomon's toxin, once obscure, spurred new interest in identifying unusual compounds. His case shaped early American toxicology more than any textbook. But the deeper wound was cultural. The notion that a man like Solomon, patient, dutiful, intelligent, trusted, could harbor an ocean of grief and methodical fury, frightened those who benefited from the institution that had created his pain. If a healer could become a harbinger of reckoning, then what, they wondered, lay inside all those other lives they believed they owned? The story of Solomon Fairfax became a whispered parable, a reminder that systems built on human suffering often give birth to their own ghosts. Do you believe his vengeance carried justice, or only more ruin? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more forgotten histories like this, subscribe and walk with us again. The past is never truly buried. It waits beneath the soil, under the magnolia roots, in the silence of old graves, waiting for someone willing to listen. The trial that followed unfolded like a wound being opened in public. Charleston, in all its preening certainty, gathered to watch the proceedings with a collective unease it refused to name. Some in the crowd came seeking reassurance that their world was still orderly. Some came for spectacle. A few came because they sensed, without wanting to admit it, that something terrible and truthful was about to be said out loud. There was no mystery to the charges. Solomon's confession lay before the court in his own clear handwriting. The city's physicians supplied testimony detailing the strange paralysis that had rendered the 6 survivors motionless and aware. The 9 dead men, buried across 4 years, formed a constellation of evidence that no one could ignore once the toxin was explained. But beneath these facts ran a current the trial could not dam. The question of what had driven a healer to fashion a weapon from his knowledge, and whom the real indictment belonged to. District Attorney Charles Rutledge spoke for the prosecution. His tone was crisp, clipped, a performance sharpened by the presence of so many anxious planters and merchants. He framed Solomon's actions as a moral collapse, a monstrous revolt against natural order. The murders, he insisted, were born of a criminal mind, not of circumstances. The law, he proclaimed, must hold firm. The defense, assigned because the court demanded such gestures, was led by Benjamin Crawford, a man who understood from the beginning that there was no winning here. His strategy was not to pardon Solomon, but to reveal the unbearable truth that had created him. Through his questioning, the court listened to descriptions of the slave market as it actually was. The screams, the bindings, the cataloging of human traits as if they were livestock standards. Witnesses spoke of families split for debts, of children sold across borders never to be seen again. The courtroom air grew thick, eyes hardened, but no one could unhear what was being said. Then they brought Solomon forward. He stood as a man who had waited years to speak his truth to the faces of those who had denied it. His voice was low and steady when he recounted the roadside where Celia had been left to bleed. He described the wagon rumbling away with his children inside it. He described Marcus's frightened questions, Samuel's trembling, Grace's tiny hands reaching for her mother. He spoke of the forced calm he had worn like a mask, so he would not be whipped into silence. "I healed men who believed their wealth made them just," he said. "I saved their children while they sold mine. If I am to be punished for this revenge, then let it be understood why it was born." When the 6 survivors took the stand, their words rippled through the courtroom like a cold tide. Each described how it felt to lie trapped inside an unmoving body, the terror of hearing physicians pronounce them dead, the tears of wives and children, the tightening of their own lungs as they fought to break the paralysis. One man spoke of feeling his coffin boards being measured. Another said he attempted to pray but could not form the words in his mind. The experiences were so hauntingly vivid, they left many in the room pale. But even those terrible testimonies carried an unexpected weight. The acknowledgement, spoken or implied, that what they had endured was the reflection, however distorted, of what enslaved families endured daily. It was the first time many white Charlestonians were forced to confront the idea that suffering is not evenly distributed just because law says it must be so. Solomon listened to every word, his face unreadable. Thomas Grimby, the journalist whose careful notes had guided the investigation, became an uneasy figure in the trial. His articles were reprinted throughout the South, meticulous, relentless, tinged with a strange empathy. Grimby never excused the killings, but he refused to ignore their origins. Citizens condemned him for it. Others quietly thanked him. History would later reveal how deeply the story marked him. His journals show sleepless months, recurring dreams of men trapped in their own bodies, and a sense that his reporting had peeled back a truth no society should have been comfortable hiding. The most devastating revelations came from Hathaway himself. The doctor, pale and stricken, confessed he had never considered the power he placed into Solomon's hands each time he taught him a new procedure or left him alone with complex compounds. He had believed, like many in his world, that proximity to skill did not equal capacity for rebellion or calculation. His testimony, meant to absolve him, only magnified the blindness of men who had built their lives on assumptions about hierarchy. Speed led, then, to a dinner at Captain William Dandridge's house, a vaulted room of crystal and shipping men whose talk made the economics of human cargo seem like a ledger rather than a crime. Solomon arranged to serve that dinner through kitchen contacts, a borrowed place among cooks and washers. He spiked a brandy-soaked dessert intended for the captain alone. The toxin worked as it had been taught, a slow, perfect silencing, but the setting changed the consequences. Captain Dandridge collapsed not in private but in front of a dozen witnesses. Where a discreet death in a physician's office could be passed with a polite note, a body felled at a social table provoked immediate, loud questions. Physicians at the table, summoned quickly, found a scene that felt wrong. One pronounced the possibility of poisoning aloud. News spread like grease on a pan. Thomas Grimby arrived before morning, whispering servants, uneasy guests, a list of interactions that placed Solomon at the scene. The net tightened. Connections began to appear in ink. The same assistant at multiple deaths, whispers about a man with an unusual botanical knowledge, and the steady, eerie triangulation of appointments and burials. With Grimby watching and with a new doctor on the horizon, Solomon made a choice born of desperation. If his method could no longer be safely repeated in private, he would seize an hour where several of his targets would be gathered and make the deaths the same mechanized event. He found that hour in a planned meeting, a June 15th gathering at Henderson and Associates, where 6 slave traders meant to finalize contracts. The office's gas lighting system became his instrument. Over 2 nights, he concentrated the paralytic into a volatile form and introduced it into the gas line that fed the lawyer's office. The idea was simple, brutal. When the lamps were lit, the compound would move through air, bite at lungs and mucus, and render every man in the room into the same conscious stillness he had perfected. On the appointed evening, Solomon stood in the alley and watched the windows bloom with lamplight. Within a half hour, the office quieted. He admitted himself with a copy of a key and found 6 men rigid around a table, their eyes tracing him with the mute accusation of prey. He moved from one to the other, and as he had with Fitzpatrick, told them what they were about to experience. The sensation of being buried while awake, the slow private hours they would face once their bodies were declared dead and laid to rest. In that room, he became, briefly, the instrument of a truth he felt needed delivering. Then footsteps outside, another presence he had not accounted for. Thomas Grimby, having followed leads and habits to the very building he had suspected, burst through the door and found himself facing a tableau that answered every fevered theory he had scribbled into his ledger. In the paused rotation of the moment, Grimby's journalistic instincts and his human being met. He saw the terror in the eyes of those men and the compelled composure in the figure of the slave who stood like a calm column in the wreckage of his own plan. "So it's true," Grimby said, quieter than the lamp glow. "Someone has been killing Charleston's elite." Solomon made no flight. He did not try to pretend innocence. He spoke of his family, of the auction, of the roadside where Celia lay bleeding. He explained that law had not helped him, that he had learned to use the knowledge of life to force a measure of reckoning on the men who had profited from his losses. Grimby did not turn him in at once. He could have. The journalist could have called constables and ended the narrative. Instead, he stood with the terrible dilemma of a man who knew the law and who understood the law's moral blinding. They were interrupted by voices, constables drawn by a witness's report and by the inevitable spread of alarm. Solomon could have fled. He did not. When officers forced open the room, they found 6 apparently dead men and a slave who made no effort to escape. Solomon confessed, and his voice, flat and resolute, filled the quiet. He described method. He named men. He handed over a ledger of death that matched the stories Grimby had been trying to tell. The arrest was swift. The confession became evidence. And as the constables led Solomon away, the city's polite surfaces began, at last, to crack. The men who had been laid on mahogany tables would live to tell their stories, but others had already been interred. The discoveries at St. Michael's, the fingernail marks, and the journal buried beneath the magnolia would later stitch the fragments into a nightmare the city could not politely ignore. Colonel Fitzpatrick's death came on a winter afternoon, December 15, 1852, the kind that presses the air thin and brittle. Hathaway was with another patient, and so Solomon was left to prepare the colonel's usual treatment. He moved with the practiced calm of someone who had poured a lifetime into exact measurements. When he slipped the colorless drops into the colonel's remedy, he did it with the same hand that had once saved a child from a fever. The medicine tasted familiar. The colonel swallowed it without suspicion. Solomon sat with him as the poison took hold. He watched as the man's features slackened, as the familiar arrogance drained into an expression that flared into recognition, and then, very quickly, mute terror. Solomon spoke then, softly, like a man reading a verdict aloud. He named the auction. He named the day. He named the laughter that had sold his children. He told the colonel, in a voice that had once coaxed people back from feverish delirium, that this would be different, that the body would be still while the mind remained wide awake, a cage of flesh. When Hathaway returned, Solomon presented himself as the grieving technician of a sudden tragedy. The doctor's examination found no sign of foul play. Heart failure, given the colonel's history, was reasonable. Fitzpatrick's funeral was proper and public. His coffin was lowered into St. Michael's soil, and the first shovel of dirt fell over him. Solomon stood apart, and as wood met wood and earth drowned sound, he imagined the burrowing hours his victim would endure, the slow dawning of awareness as darkness closed. The success of Fitzpatrick's burial proved 2 things. It proved the toxin worked. It proved that, in a culture that expected death to be both swift and dignified, the outward signs could be counted on to mask something far crueler. It also taught Solomon about appetite, that his method could be repeated and perhaps perfected. He wrote that night in his journal with cold satisfaction, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain. But patience had limits." Charleston, ever hungry for gossip and explanation, began to take note of patterns. Solomon's quiet diligence at the practice, his unobtrusive presence at Hathaway's side, shielded him for a time. Yet the city's fabric cannot be pulled taut forever without a loose thread showing. A young journalist named Thomas Grimby, working for the Charleston Mercury, had begun to mark a map of deaths and burials. He visited St. Michael's with a small leather notebook, and his curiosity held a persistence that would prove dangerous to Solomon's design. Solomon's second target, Judge Marcus Calverton, carried a reputation that smelled of witless jurisprudence, a man who had on record argued in the courtroom that the separation of enslaved families was an economic necessity worth the social cost. The judge's migraines and advancing age made him an easy candidate for a death that would be rationalized by physicians. Solomon's plan relied on subtlety and timing. Yet when he prepared the dose for Calverton in April of 1853, haste and a fraction of miscalculation shifted the balance. The judge's convulsion was faster than Solomon had intended. The paralysis arrived in brutal completeness, and, as Dr. Hathaway examined the body, something about the muscles and the eyes gave him pause. "Strange," he murmured, tracing the rigid limbs with a confusion more clinical than accusatory. For a single thin moment, Solomon feared discovery. Then Hathaway, constrained by the medical language and understanding of his time, settled on stroke and suffering. He spoke of the judge's likely torment in the same terms that would have justified his burial. Solomon watched the coffin descend for a second time and understood how close he had come to unmaking everything he had built. By spring of 1853, the pressure to finish had compounded. Dr. Hathaway announced the possible arrival of a junior partner, Dr. Timothy Henderson, a Philadelphian with the newest training and the curiosity of youth. Solomon watched the notice of a new hand like a shadow crossing his plans. Henderson's presence made the garden of opportunity smaller. More scrutiny meant fewer chances to hide the tincture's tracks. Speed became a necessity, and speed invited mistakes. A rut on the coastal road changed everything. The wagon wheel caught a deep furrow. Celia was thrown into the roadside and struck her head. Blood on the gravel. The traders, intent on delivering cargo intact, declared her a lost package and drove on. Solomon was shackled. He screamed and grasped at the air where she lay. Only the other slaves' restraint saved him from a fury that would have punished all of them. At the market in Charleston, Solomon watched his children sold off like bundles of another man's fortune. Marcus went north to a rice planter who used boys in the irrigation works. Samuel was sold into a cotton farm's brutal upkeep. Little Grace into a Savannah household that swallowed small lives into service and silence. Solomon's face did not betray fury. He learned early that visible emotions could be punished twice over. But inside, something fractured beyond repair. The healer who had spent a life mending flesh watched the casual commerce of family. The men who joked over the auction block were the same men who dined on cultured plates, who sat on church boards and charity committees, virtuous men whose wealth had teeth. Dr. Hathaway purchased Solomon that same day, paying more than usual for a man whose skill was known. The doctor needed hands steady as clockwork. The city's elite needed remedies their own physicians did not possess. As Solomon left the market, the city shrank and the idea of patience settled, cold and deliberate, into him. He would wait. He would learn. He would make them answer. That evening, in a small room over Hathaway's practice, Solomon set down a pen and opened the leather book he had managed to keep. By candlelight, in the careful hand he had been taught, he wrote what would become both confession and plan. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I'm still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience. The months at the practice were, outwardly, a blur of poultices and appointments. Solomon mixed compounds with the same precision he'd always used. He set bandages and soothed fevers. But underneath the ordinary ministrations, he kept a ledger of a different kind. He learned Charleston's social map in whispers. Who dined with whom? Who financed what? Which men had been present at the auction that had split his family? He listened for names and noted them in his journal. He listened to servants and house slaves in the grand homes who traded confidences over kitchen fires. Slowly, the pattern became a list. Links, backers, purchasers. Men who sat on the same committees as Hathaway. Men whose charity masked their commerce. And in the stacks of medical treatises, Solomon found instruction that would change everything. Hathaway's library contained books on exotic toxins and plant poisons, texts that spoke of compounds capable of freezing muscle without stealing sensation. A treatise on South American plant toxins mentioned a vine that could induce total paralysis while leaving the mind agonizingly awake. Solomon traced the plant's mentions to a greenhouse in Charleston, then to Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw at the College of Charleston. Crenshaw, fond of curiosities, welcomed a willing hand in his glass houses. Solomon tended the specimens and, in secret, learned to coax the vine and extract the compound. Months of practice on mice taught him dosage. Too little merely produced malaise. Too much killed. The narrow range in the middle produced a perfect, undetectable stillness, a corpse to the untrained eye, and a living tomb to the victim's mind. He cultivated the toxin into a colorless, odorless liquid that could be mixed into medicines and food. The calculation was monstrous but clinical. Within an hour of ingestion, the body would lock. Breathing and pulse would be so faint they would be missed by 1850s sensibilities. To most physicians of the time, the victim had simply died. To the man trapped inside, the world would not end at the last breath. It would sharpen into a slow, intimate terror. So he waited, patient as roots. The first name he circled was Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a rice planter who had made jokes at the auction and who visited Hathaway for gout. His appointments were regular, his arrogance famous, his house populated only by terrified slaves. The colonel's weak heart made a sudden death plausible to any casual observer. Solomon marked him and waited for the hour when medicine and malice would touch. Beneath the old oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery, where Spanish moss hangs like memory itself, there are 9 graves the city's finest tried very hard to forget. For a century and more, Charleston's polite society turned away from those stones. 9 names carved into pale marble. 9 men who died between 1851 and 1855 under the same terrible rubric. The sudden paralysis, the doctor's quiet verdict of a merciful death. It read like a cruel coincidence. Until 1923, when men with shovels and flashlights pried open history's loose boards and found something that could not be smoothed over with polite silence. The lids inside those coffins bore the pale crescents of fingernails scraped in panic. The bodies lay twisted as if in last, private bargains to live. And beneath a magnolia, roots tangled around a leather-bound journal, neat, deliberate handwriting, the name Solomon Fairfax on the title page, and entries that stretched across 4 years like a map of vengeance. The pages promised a beginning and an end, a family in flames, a healer turned architect of torment, 9 men sewn into earth while they were still breathing. Before we continue, become one of the few who follow these buried things. Subscribe and ring the bell. Stay with us as we trace the slow arc of this darkness. Tell us where you're listening from. Tell us you witness these buried truths, because some stories insist on being heard more than once. The first entry is dated March 15, 1851. The line that opens the book is terrible in its simplicity. "Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it." Charleston in the 1850s presented itself as a jewel, white-pillared mansions gazing down the Cooper River, fortunes braided to rice and cotton, a cluster of dynasties who believed the law and custom had wrapped them in invulnerability. Their ailments, mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, the shuddering paralysis that stalked the wealthy households, were treated discreetly by private physicians summoned like temperate storms. A small medical community held enormous social power. To be accepted by a planter's circle was to be granted a certain kind of immunity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway opened his practice on Meeting Street in 1845, and by the 1850s had become a quiet fixture among those planters. His success owed as much to his own skill as to the assistant at his elbow. A man named Solomon Fairfax, purchased expressly for the practice because of a reputation that whispered through the low country, a knowledge of plants and compounds passed down by a line of healer ancestors. Solomon's hands were steady, his mind precise. He handled Latin medical terms with the ease of a well-read man. He could tincture and distill, prepare drafts that eased convulsions, lay poultices that stopped fevers the white physicians could not. Patients requested him. They trusted him. But before Meeting Street and the lamp-lit corridors of Hathaway's office, Solomon had lived another life. For 32 years, he had lived on the Pemberton plantation, 15 miles from Charleston, where he had married Celia and raised 3 children, Marcus, Samuel, Grace, in the cramped honesty of the slave quarters. The Paytons allowed him certain liberties because his skill saved lives that kept their labor valuable. This grudging respect was measured not in empathy, but in profit. He tended their wounds and theirs, moderated outbreaks, kept the plantation's human machinery running on the slender mercy of his hands. Then, in March of 1851, the ledger books finally caught up. Edmund Payton's debts and his creditors' impatience meant people were to be sold to settle numbers on a page. The sale included Solomon's family. He offered years of himself rather than lose them. He proposed every arrangement a desperate man could imagine. Peyton, pressed by creditors, refused. The sale was set for March 14th. The morning low and humid and thick as a closing lid. Storm clouds crouched over the Ashley River. Solomon spent that night memorizing his children's faces, counting their breaths like rosary beads. Celia held herself like a woman who had accepted a terrible bargain and was teaching her small ones gentleness in a world that did not grant it. Marcus, 8, wide-eyed and quick. Samuel, 6, the quiet mimic of a healer's patience. Grace, 4, clinging to her mother with a small, desperate intelligence. When the trader's wagon came, it took them with 6 other families, hands bound by custom, by law, by commerce. Promises were made. We'll find each other again. An arithmetic of comfort that everyone knew would not stand.